I want to talk for a second about counterexamples. In logic classes, a lot of times what we're doing is formalizing and making very precise and clear things that we already do in the way that we think normally as human beings. And oftentimes I'll bet that when you're in a conversation with somebody and maybe you disagree about some claim and we've been presenting an argument for it, they've been presenting an argument against it, and you're not really coming to a clear resolution, you might have felt compelled to come up with a counterexample, saying, well, let's just assume that these things were true, and then somehow that's supposed to show that their argument is bad. Okay, so let's back up and kind of get back into the terminology that we're familiar with. How does a counterexample work? Basically, the way that a counterexample works is that you satisfy the structure of the argument and show that that structure leads to or can lead to a false conclusion. Now, back up a second even more. Think about what it means for an argument to be valid. If the argument's valid, then when the premises are true, the conclusion is guaranteed to be true. Now, if you can come up with an example that shows that that structure of an argument, even if the premises are true, can lead to a false conclusion, then what have you just shown about the argument? You've just shown that it's possible to have true premises and a false conclusion. At least it's possible with regard to that particular structure. Now, this is important to note. When we're dealing with deductive arguments, the validity of an argument does not come from what it says. So despite all the examples that we've read in our book, whatever the arguments are talking about in the premises, the content is not what makes the argument valid. What makes an argument valid is its form. Now, if you remember if you watched the video where we talked about validity, and I used the Sylvester McMonkey McBean example, the first premise was all Sneetches have stars. Sylvester McMonkey McBean is a Sneetch, and the conclusion was, so Sylvester McMonkey McBean has a star. Now, the validity of this argument has nothing to do with stars or being a Sneetch or anything like that. The validity has everything to do with the form of the argument. And what we can do to establish the argument's form is just take out the content. So I'm going to take out every time we saw Sylvester McMonkey McBean, and I'm just going to put a blank there. Let's call that the letter C. Let's take out everywhere where Sneetch appears, and we'll put a blank there and just refer to that as letter A. And we'll take out everywhere where the word star appears and just make that a letter B. Now we've removed all the meaningful content from this argument. So all we have left is the structure or the form of the argument. All A have B, C is an A, therefore C has a B. This is a valid argument form, which means this: we can substitute anything we want in here. And no matter what you put in, as long as you're consistently putting the C's where they go, the A's where they go, no matter what you put in there, you will have a valid argument, meaning you'll have an argument where if the premises are true, the conclusion would be guaranteed to be true. You may take a second and just try it out. Anything that you plug in will result in a valid argument. If the premises are true, the conclusion will have to be true. Now, as you plug stuff in, you may put something in that's clearly a false premise and end up with a false conclusion. But that's possible in a valid argument. An argument is valid as long as there's a relationship, even if these are silly statements. If they're true, and they would guarantee that this is true, you've got a valid argument. Okay, so if validity comes from its form, we can test validity by testing an argument's form. So the way the counterexample method works is you take an argument, you remove the content and reproduce the form of an argument, and then you try to come up with an example, what we call a substitution instance, where you put content into that argument form and you demonstrate this. This form is such that I can come up with an example where the premises are clearly true and the conclusion is clearly false. Now notice we've got a few conditions in there that have to be met for a counterexample to be an effective one. And it's effective if it demonstrates that an argument's invalid. Here's what they have to be. One, the argument form of your new substitution instance has to be accurate to the original argument. So if you show that a form is invalid, but that form is not the form of the original argument, then all you've done is shown that this form that nobody's using is an invalid form. So it's got to match the original argument. Second, you've got to reproduce the argument form with a substitution instance where the premises are clearly true. If the premises are in question in your substitution instance and somebody wants to say the conclusion's false, then they can say, yeah, it's false because you've got a false premise. Similarly, if you don't get an obviously false conclusion, somebody could say, well, yeah, this example doesn't do any work because notice that the conclusion might actually be true. So you really need to meet all the conditions. The form has to be accurate to the original. Your substitution instance needs to have clearly true premises and a clearly false conclusion. And then you have a successful counterexample. Now, what does that mean? If we have a successful counterexample, what have we succeeded in doing? We've succeeded in showing that the argument form of the original argument has this quality. It's possible for the premises to be true, and yet the conclusion still be false. And if that's the case, if it's possible that the argument has true premises and a false conclusion, then there's not a relationship between the premises and conclusion where the premises would guarantee the truth of the conclusion. So the argument's invalid. Notice, we can't really demonstrate that an argument is valid through the counterexample method, but we can demonstrate that it's invalid. And sometimes you can try to produce a counterexample and not succeed. That doesn't mean that the argument is valid. It just means you tried and didn't come up with a good counterexample. Maybe you just weren't creative enough. Maybe somebody else will come along and come up with a good one. But if you try and succeed, you have demonstrated that the argument is invalid, and now you know something about the argument.